On this episode, we talk a little bit more about the United States Agency for International Development by talking to the former head of the agency's faith-based office. That's coming up. Hey everyone, welcome to Church and Maine, the podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Well, it was about a month ago that I chatted with Alex Morse from Church World Service, and we talked about the organization's partnership with USAID, in light of the agency being shut down by the Trump administration, more specifically by the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, headed by Elon Musk. And in that episode, we talked about the effects of canceling contracts and winding down the agency and how this would have a dire effect around the world, literally life and death. This was an incredibly popular episode, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about USAID, this time from the inside. So I talked to Peter Mandeville. Peter is currently the professor of international affairs in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Virginia. And from 2024 to 2025, he served as the director for the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and senior advisor for faith engagement at the United States Agency for International Development. Before that, from 2022 to 2024, he was the Senior Advisor for Religion and Inclusive Societies at the United States Institute of Peace. And that agency will factor in later in the podcast, so please stay tuned. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about what had happened at USAID, or if this is the first time you've heard of this and want to know more about this, I'm hoping that you'll give this a listen. And I'd hope that you will share this too, because I think this and the past episode, people need to know about what's been going on. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Peter Mandeville. Peter, thank you for joining me today. I wanted to actually start by learning a little bit about you, your faith background, and just also your work background.
Sure, absolutely. And Dennis, I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with you today as well. So, I was actually born and raised in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. Many of your listeners will be aware that Saudi Arabia is a fairly intensely conservative Muslim country. My parents were both kind of broadly of Protestant Christian background, but I wasn't really raised in any particular religious tradition or faith tradition, but I was raised with religion all around me, in ways as it does in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia in particular. Religion really like dictates and shapes the rhythm of the day. And so this instilled in me a lifelong fascination with religion as a social force. And so, I have never described myself as being a member of or an adherent of any particular faith tradition, but just someone who has always been deeply respectful of faith and the ways in which religion enables and inspires so much good in the world. And so that's something that I've tried to explore and reflect in my academic work. And then later on, as I got more involved in U.S. foreign policy making, diplomacy, and development work as well.
And how have you seen it as a social force in your in your growing up, but also as you've entered into the workspace. I'm kind of curious, especially growing up as you did in the Middle East,
Yeah.
how you saw it as a force for social good.
Yeah. I mean, I think I, first began to, um, engage questions about religion as an important social force professionally, and after I moved to the United States, from born and raised in the Middle East, then I moved to the UK and Europe, and so
Mm,
didn't actually find my way to this country, which has been my country of citizenship since my birth, until I was basically in my 30s. Um, and that was right before and after the 9/11 attacks, right?
mm,
And so that's when a very particular discourse about Islam and Muslims set in this country. And of course, to me, as someone who grew up with Muslims around me, and Islam is something not alien and different, but something very natural and familiar to me. The way that Islam and Muslims were talked about was just, there was such dissonance I experienced in terms of what I knew of Islam and Muslims from my life experience and the way that Islam was being talked about, right? And of course, at that
mm,
time after 9/11, the idea was that Islam is connected to terrorism. Islam is connected to risks to American national security. Islam is somehow the opposite of the American way of life. Our values are different from theirs, and I knew that not to be true, and so what I found myself focused on at that point is trying to bring to light and to, through public scholarship, help people understand the ways in which Islam has also been a social force in so many countries around the world across a vast geography stretching from West Africa through to the archipelago of Southeast Asia over the centuries, a force that has inspired so much beauty, so much art, ethics, morals, humanitarianism, and to kind of help bring that much more multifaceted portrait of Islam to the awareness of a broader American public. And then later on, I had the opportunity, when I started working directly in the U.S. government to kind of try to help shape U.S. foreign policy in its engagement with the Muslim world in ways that would be more constructive.
So, how did you find yourself in your role, which was kind of basically partnering kind of the USAID with um, religious institutions? How did you find yourself ending up in that role, and what was that like?
Well, my kind of work at the intersection of religion and U.S. foreign policy actually didn't start at the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Hmm.
I was first doing that work at the State Department during the Obama administration,
Hmm.
and President Obama, if you remember, had kind of tried to hit restart on U.S. relations with Muslims around the world. He gave the very famous Cairo speech in 2009, where he was trying to sort of send a message of partnership, kind of to extend a hand to many Muslims around the world who, in the aftermath of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the kind of rise of American counterterrorism policies, kind of felt that they had basically been maligned by the United States, and that we saw them inherently as a source of security concerns. And so I, got involved initially in some of that work. But at the same time, I also had the opportunity to just start thinking more broadly about how the State Department engages and thinks about religion more broadly in our diplomacy, not just these
Hmm.
questions about Islam and Muslims, but the broader question of do American diplomats and foreign policy professionals actually understand religion? Do they have that capacity, and do they have the capacity to engage with and work with faith-based organizations and religious actors in the context of their work in order to, try and make progress towards shared goals and values? So I started doing that work at the State Department. And then later, during the most recent past administration, the Biden-Harris administration, was offered the opportunity to lead the faith partnership work of the United States Agency for International Development, which had actually been working with religious organizations, faith-based organizations, literally since it opened its doors in the early 1960s. But in 2002, USAID set up a dedicated center for faith-based partnerships to try and make that kind of faith outreach a more systematic part of its work.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 2023, the USAID released an entire official policy called Building Bridges and Development, which was the first time the agency had ever developed a systematic policy to explain how and why it partners with faith-based organizations. And I was then brought in to kind of lead the implementation of that policy, to turn it from being, words on paper into like stuff in the world.
Why do you think it's so important for the agency to have those relationships with religious groups? I think people might normally think, well, USAID is a government agency and the church and state and all of that, but there has been a partnership, and I think you are correct. It has been there since its inception.
Yeah.
Why does that matter?
Well, it matters for a variety of reasons. It matters because some of the faith-based humanitarian and development organizations are some of the most experienced, high-capacity, expert implementers of humanitarian programs out there.
Mm-hmm.
And we simply rely on them. We need their experience and their skills and their capacity in order to meet the enormous humanitarian challenges that we face in the world. So just from the basic point of view of, the U.S. government should be partnering with all relevant players in the work that it does. Faith-based organizations, when you think of the scale and capacity of organizations like Catholic Relief Services, Islamic Relief USA, World Vision, HIAS, American Jewish World Service, International Network of Engaged Buddhists, these are organizations that matter, and so we need to be partnering with them. But there's also, beyond that, there's also, I think, distinctive added value that faith-based organizations have in so many situations that we face. Take, for example, natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, things like that. Those faith-based organizations, particularly the local ones, they have, such close organic relationships to the communities in which they're based, right? Which means that they're the ones who have been on the ground long before the disaster happens. They're the ones who are on the front lines of providing relief at the height of the disaster. And they're also the ones who are going to still be around after the international response to that disaster goes away and turns its attention to whatever the next crisis is.
Mm-hmm.
And so from the point of view of sustainability, the enduring capacity to provide much needed services and relief, faith-based organizations are so important. And then finally, there are certain kinds of issues that we work on in humanitarian and development work that are by their nature very sensitive in some societies and communities, or in some cases where there's a politics around them, and high levels of suspicion or distrust towards foreign governments or foreign donors that are wanting to come in and provide relief and services, and for often very good reasons, people just don't trust those international actors. And we find sometimes, though, that because of the unique, close, trusting relationships that particularly faith-based organizations have with their local communities, we sometimes feel that it's possible for us to provide services and benefit to particular segments of some communities when we work with faith-based organizations, or we're
Hmm.
only able to reach those populations when we work with local faith-based organizations rather than other kinds of implementing partners. So those are just a few of the many reasons why it's vitally important for us to have that faith actor engagement in international humanitarian and development work.
So one of the things that, of course, has been happening with all the actions in the current administration, especially through the Department of Governmental Efficiency or DOGE, um, are these cuts, the kind of the shutting down of programs and actually the entire agency. And I know that that's still going through the courts and everything. But I recently talked to someone from Church World Service, just about the loss of programs and what the results of those things are. And I kind of like to get your opinion. What the first question would be first is, what are we losing by the disruption that's happening? And then secondly, um, is there a future? I mean, can these things be restored, or are we basically back to zero?
Oh, Dennis, we are losing so much in the way that the current administration has approached this. And I want to say at the outset that any new incoming administration, of course, has the right, arguably the responsibility, to take a look at all the programs, everything that's being done to make sure that those things are aligned with their priorities, and their understanding of the national interest and national security needs of the United States. And if they deem that certain activities are not, then there are things they can do to, in a sort of rational and responsible way, bring those programs to a conclusion. But the way that they've done this, the scale at which they've terminated programs, the speed at which they've done it, the erratic nature of the approach where they will just suddenly halt work on a project, and then send a formal termination notice, but then 2 hours later tell them that, well, the termination notice might not be accurate. You're still funded, but don't do any work yet. It causes so much confusion and paralysis in the system. And the problem is that so much of the humanitarian development work that we do, it operates in a way that you can't just kind of flip the switch off and everything kind of pauses. And then at some point you flip it on and everything goes back into motion. The moment you stop work, the moment you stop the pipeline of funding, and the multiple layers of procurement and contracting that are involved in these, you immediately force, partners within that system, often, down at the local level, in some of the most impoverished countries in the world, to suddenly have to stop providing certain kinds of services, including certain kinds of medical and life-saving services, and to start having to do things like lay people off. Right? You immediately start, putting people in employment precarity. People see the writing on the wall and they leave, meaning that even if you turn the funding back on, you've lost your staff. You can't just kind of start that program back up again. And also, so much of the work that we do, that the U.S. government funds in the development world, is done in partnership with other kinds of donors and multilateral organizations like the United Nations in a carefully designed way where there's an integration, right? The programs we do are designed to complement and work side by side with programs that other donors are funding, in order to have the desired impact and effect. And the moment you turn off the American component of it, that then, of course, means that the other partners can't carry out and achieve their goals because they've been relying on us for the program to work as a whole. And so, that's what I think has been so damaging, right? There was a way to do this. If the administration wanted to make fundamental changes to the nature of U.S. foreign assistance, they could have done that in a way that was not so destructive, and that wouldn't have had such a horrendous, set of knock-on effects, in terms of the lives of people around the world. Is there a future for it? Yes, I mean, I think we're already starting to see some of the contours of what the future of U.S. foreign assistance is likely to, look like. It seems that they're going to kind of follow through with dismantling USAID as an independent agency, and to merge some aspects of it into the Department of State. And so they're talking about things like creating a new Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance within the Department of State. And the general idea seems to be that they're going to dial down the development side of things fairly heavily, and put more of the focus on humanitarian work. And so there is a future for it. It's not that U.S. foreign assistance is going to stop. It looks like it's going to evolve significantly in terms of the kinds of issues that it covers and that it works on. And again, when you look at some of the things they're proposing, one could say, look, this some of this makes sense, perhaps, right?
Hmm.
But the way they've gone about it is so fundamentally different from the way that other countries that have also, for example, recently merged their development agencies into their foreign ministries. Canada's done that. The UK has done that. Australia has done that in recent years. But they did it in a gradual, incremental way that avoided fundamental disruption and frankly loss of life around the world in the way we are right now.
Yeah, because I think one of the things, obviously one of the programs that has been very important that comes out of USAID has been PEPFAR, and that has been disrupted, and that does have an impact on people's lives.
PEPFAR, what's so sad about PEPFAR, Dennis, I think, is that there was such a strong bipartisan consensus around the idea that PEPFAR has, far and away, if you even want to, even those people who want and need to think about U.S. foreign assistance kind of in terms of return on investment, the amount of money, and it's been considerable, that's been put into PEPFAR over the years, but the actual tangible, measurable impact that it has, where you can show a direct connection between that money and the saving literally of dozens of millions of lives. Like that connection is so clear. And up until fairly recently, PEPFAR, was a program lauded by Republicans. And of course, it started under Republican administration. Former President George W. Bush deserves enormous credit for the vision originally behind PEPFAR. But it's a program that Republicans and Democrats alike over the years have really rallied around. But in more recent years, I think, so many of the issues that we've been dealing with in the United States kind of domestically in the realm of the cultural wars, have started to kind of work their way into some of the conversations we've been having about certain aspects of foreign assistance, including PEPFAR. And so, even prior to the actions that the current administration has taken, there were already some considerable risks to PEPFAR because it was about to come up for reauthorization on Capitol Hill,
Hmm.
to allow the program to kind of move into a new phase of activity. And there were, some the members of Congress that had been raising concerns about the idea that somehow PEPFAR was being used to fund abortions, which simply is not true. But we live and operate in an environment these days where there's just so much mis and disinformation that kind of clouds our ability to kind of run well-informed and rational policy making and legislative processes around these kinds of things. And so, I am really worried about that, because when you start tinkering around and disrupting programs like PEPFAR that by their very nature and mechanism mean that people need to reliably receive specific life-saving services on a very regular and fixed schedule, and you bring that kind of uncertainty and erratic procurement stuff into the picture, it has such profound and negative effects on people's lives and livelihoods. I'm hoping that PEPFAR will continue. We are the signs we see coming out of this administration, and it's the sort of draft new blueprint, suggests that, PEPFAR will still be part of the picture, but I worry that, it's still got some stormy days ahead of it in terms of its political fate.
Why do you think that the way that this has gone about has gone that way? I mean, that instead of, as you said, there's always room for reform in organizations, but the way that it's happening, it, to be honest, feels like almost kind of like it's a smash and grab or a
Yeah.
vandalism. And why do you think that it's being handled that way?
So I think that what we're seeing here and why it's playing out this way is kind of, in a sense, learned behavior based on the experience of the first Trump administration, right? I think when President Trump won in 2016, honestly, I don't think he was expecting to win. It meant that in the immediate aftermath of the election, he didn't already have a deep bench of well-experienced officials and policymakers that he was ready to deploy out to the vast federal bureaucracy in the way that I know, Hillary Clinton did. She had, an entire network of people that were ready the day after what she'd hoped would have been her victory, literally to that next day get started in doing a transition to her administration. Trump didn't have that. And so he had to very rapidly throw something together in 2016. And it meant that he ended up having to rely on a lot of people that were kind of part of the Republican foreign policy establishment, whose views were more centrist in
Hmm.
nature, right? And they were, they had a strong constraining effect, I think, in terms of some of the things that he wanted to do that they saw as kind of outside the norm of how the United States engages and works in the world. And they were able to kind of pull that back. And I think that was frustrating to him. And so I think this time around, having learned that lesson, he made sure to not include any of those kind of foreign policy establishment people. Rather, he included people that he knew were ideologically aligned with him, but who also knew how the system worked, what buttons to press, what levers to pull to make things happen. And I think the idea was we have to go in hard and we have to go in fast, because if we try to do this in a slow, incremental way through due process, then the bureaucracy will simply push it back. And so the only way to make progress is to kind of go in this chaotic slash and burn, or as you put it, smash and grab fashion. And I think that's why we're seeing it play out this way.
What would you say to people who think that USAID basically supports really weird programs? I remember actually the president talking about that in his State of the Union, or not State of the Union, but address to Congress. That's actually come across on Twitter and other social media. How do you help people understand the value of this agency and its work with and partner work with religious agencies, which is not brought up as much?
No, no. I mean, part of what's been so frustrating to me, Dennis, is not just the, again, chaotic, erratic way they've gone about disrupting all this work. I mean, that was bad enough. But the fact that it's been accompanied by this rhetoric of accusation, right?
Hmm.
That USAID is a criminal organization, that it's run by radical lunatics, that it, is heavily focused on things like exporting transgender ideology. Right? And then there's these, various programs that they trotted out and sort of said, did you know that USAID is funding these programs? And there was so much inaccuracy and information that when you actually took one by one each of the programs that they mentioned, what you would find very quickly is that in at least half of the cases, the programs in question were not USAID programs. They were aspects of programs funded through U.S. foreign assistance, but some of them were actually State Department or other agency programs rather than
Mm.
USAID programs. And again, in many cases, they were just isolated aspects of a much larger program, and they were not at all representative of the vast majority of USAID's work. Right? The vast majority of the programs and projects that USAID supported around the world, right, the single largest component of it was related to ending hunger and food security, right? Providing food to starving refugees and people in areas of the world experiencing famine, right? That's the single largest piece of what USAID does. It runs a lot of programs, focused on providing health services, and vaccine programs and life-saving medical equipment, programs focused on helping to incubate and grow small businesses and entrepreneurs, and in ways that would also then allow them to connect with American businesses to build partnerships that also benefit the United States economically as well. But we heard nothing about these programs, which actually form the majority of what USA does. And what I think is so problematic and kind of gets to another piece of what you were asking about, Dennis, I think, is that um, we know that the current administration, in terms of its political base, you know, you know, relied very heavily on support from certain segments of the American Christian community, and many of those same, particularly evangelical Christian formations and groups have their own very well developed, very experienced humanitarian and development charities, some of whom, do actually receive quite a lot of funding from the U.S. Government.
Mhm.
And so what it means is that there's actually a lot of faith-based organizations that I think feel very confused and slightly betrayed right now because, many of the, members of congregations that they're connected to, feel like they provided support to this president, only for some of these actions to appear to completely disregard and damage things that they deeply care about.
What do you think is going to be the fallout from all of this in for us as a nation, in foreign policy? What do you think is the fallout for many of the groups that have partnered, receive a fair amount of funding from USAID for their projects, from all of these actions?
Yeah, I mean, you asked the question that the entire global development sector is wrestling with right now, right? Because
Mhm.
USAID was the single biggest bilateral donor in the sense of, the United States was the single country that provided the greatest proportion of international foreign assistance aid. And again, so many aspects of the way the entire system works was organized around USAID's presence at the core of it. And so, what we're seeing now is, ongoing discussions and a lot of anxiety around how we move forward. And so people are wondering, are there sources of private funding? Are there private philanthropic foundations that would maybe be able to step up and replace aspects of what's being lost with USAID cutting off certain kinds of programs? Are there other governments that would be able to, step up their spending on foreign assistance to replace some of that? And sadly, I don't think that latter direction is likely to bear fruit because, if anything, we're seeing, the other large donor countries in Europe, like Germany and the UK, also talking about cutting their foreign assistance budgets, not eliminating, but cutting back. And so, I am deeply worried about this. But, in The other aspects of it that I think we need to be concerned about are, some people have talked about how the disappearance of USAID is likely to redound to the benefit of U.S. strategic rivals such as China and Russia that may kind of rush in to fill the space left by USAID and therefore be able to kind of reap the kind of public diplomacy and public relations dividend that has sometimes been associated with the support and assistance provided by the United States. I think there's possibly something to that concern in some settings, but I think more broadly, I think it the stopping of U.S. foreign assistance or the signals that are being sent about the devaluing of U.S. engagement and partnership in the form of foreign assistance, but even beyond that, the way that we've already started to pull away from some of our multilateral partnerships in the United Nations, the recent actions with respect to Ukraine, where the United States seemed to align itself much more closely with Russia. I think all of these things put together, and I hear this when I talk to friends and colleagues outside the United States, it's just producing this generalized sense of what is going on with your country. Like we didn't used to, and this is me imagining them talking. We certainly didn't agree with everything that you did in the world, but broadly speaking, your country was a force for good. It was reliable. We understood you. We knew where you were coming from. We knew that we could depend on you to be involved in certain issues and problems around the world, addressing global challenges in particular ways. And now we seem to be pulling away from all of that in their eyes. And so I think the impact that it's likely to have on American leadership and perceptions of the United States and its capacity to lead the world, I think that's going to be deeply, deeply problematic. Because, the way I think about it, Dennis, when I see things like, yes, this cut in U.S. foreign assistance, some of the rumors we're hearing about the idea that there may be a 50% cut to the science budget of NASA, right? That's like an extinction level event for NASA. And all of this stuff is taking place under this brand and label of making America great again. To me, that's just ridiculous, because to my mind, you don't eliminate foreign assistance to make America great again. We give foreign assistance because we're great, because we have that capacity. You don't eliminate our ability to publicly fund pioneering space science to kind of help us get answers to the great questions of the universe. We do those things because we're a great nation. And so, I worry that there is just going to be this systematic reputational hit to the United States. It's being branded as making the country great again. And I think many people around the world perceive it as just the opposite.
What can people do about this situation? Is there anything that we can do? Can we, obviously contact our representatives or senators, but I mean, what can be done when we see this happening?
Yeah. I mean, this is also the question that I'm wrestling with now, right? Because, when the things we're seeing happen, these are all mainly a result of executive action, right? And so we have these multiple branches of our government that serve in theory as checks and balances on each other, right? So when the executive branch does something, you should expect oversight to be exercised by the United States Congress. And there's also checks on the limits of that authority, the executive authority, by the judicial branch of the government. But what we seem to see, and certainly what we've largely seen with respect to the U.S. Congress, is that, the way political power is configured on Capitol Hill right now, there seems to be a party in control of the U.S. Congress that is all too willing to cooperate with even the most excessive expressions of executive authority. And maybe there is hope there, not in the short term, but in the medium term when we think ahead to the 2026 midterm elections, right? We are already seeing, around the country, expressions of concern, maybe not from President Trump's kind of MAGA base, but from independents that decided to vote for Trump this last time because they had concerns about their pocketbooks, for example, and thought that he would do something positive for the economy, and are instead seeing him tear the federal government apart, including talking about cuts to basic services that they rely on in terms of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And might vote in very different ways in 2026. So, maybe there's a medium term hope there. To me, the test I'm most looking for right now is really with respect to the judicial branch, because I think legal analysts at this point seem to generally agree that the current administration has not directly outright defied any orders from the courts. Like they've walked right up to that line, like they're playing footsie with that idea, but they haven't actually done it yet. And I suspect we'll find an occasion not too far down the line here where the administration does fairly openly defy a court order. And to me, that'll really be the test. Like, is there actually some meaningful mechanism of enforcement that the courts will be able to bring to bear to constrain this administration? Because if the answer to that question is no, then we're in a really difficult situation, at least in the short term, because it basically means the institutional checks and balances have broken down. And once that's happened, I think then what we have to rely on is going back to the citizenry, going back to the streets, going back to the ideas like mass civil disobedience, the idea that you have to shut the country down. You have to stop cooperating. And what I don't know is whether in the current way that our country operates, the current kind of sociology of the American psyche and American community right now, do we have the capacity to work together that way at the grassroots level, at scale, and en masse in order to take our country back from an effort to hijack it through executive authority? I want to hope that we do. I just don't know, because the way that information flows in the world today, the way that everyone is so sort of distracted and kind of living in their own little self-curated world, I think that creates enormous barriers to us working together in solidarity in the ways that we would need to. So I want to remain hopeful. But I'm not optimistic, honestly.
That sounds very familiar. If people want to learn more about you or to kind of talk about, connect with you in some way, are there ways that they can do so?
Yeah, absolutely. After leaving USAID at the end of the previous administration, I went back to my academic positions at George Mason University and Georgetown University. So I'm mainly doing academic work right now, but I'd be happy to engage with and follow up with any of your listeners who might want to continue kind of discussing and talking about these issues. And so if you just, I think my university email address is actually available on the website. So if you just Google my name, you'll find a way to reach out to me by email fairly easily.
All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I think that this was very informative, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Absolutely, Dennis. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
All right. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about the interview I just had. What are your thoughts about USAID? Do you think it was worthwhile to shut it down? Should it be saved? What do you think about the folding it into the State Department? Feel free to send me your thoughts by emailing me at churchandmain@substack.com. And I also wanted to let you know that I am going to be talking to someone who worked at the United States Institute of Peace, or Institute for Peace, and which has also come under scrutiny by DOJ. So please stay tuned. That episode is coming up soon. Now, I wanted to talk to you for a moment about the podcast moving forward. If you are someone that has a regular listener to this podcast, you may have noticed I've been talking a lot about the Trump administration. And I kind of struggle with that because I don't want this to become some type of religious version of MSNBC that's always kind of talking breathlessly about every little thing that's happening with this administration. That said, what's been going on, especially the last few weeks under the Trump administration, is, and this is a word that we use a lot, unprecedented. And I think that we are at an interesting point in our nation's history. And I also think that this is an important inflection point for the church. How does the church respond? How does the church act? This administration is very different from any previous administration, whether that is a Republican or a Democratic administration. You may have had your differences, but this is a very different beast that we're dealing with. And so what does this all mean, and how do we respond? Now, some people, when they talk about how the church should respond, like to look back and think about, basically think about Germany around 1932, 1933, and they like to think that we are at that same point right now. And it's interesting, I will put this link in the show notes, but there's an interesting article that was written last Sunday in the Dispatch by Paul Miller, who is a writer on foreign policy and religion. And he doesn't think that's really the right analogy. He tends to think that the analogy of where the church is at and where we are all at right now is not 1933, which is when Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor and later becomes the Fuhrer, but 1923, 10 years earlier. 1923 was an interesting time in Germany. This was just a few years after the end of World War I. Germany lost that war. The Kaiser had to abdicate. The German Empire basically ceased to exist. This was the rise of the Weimar Republic, which was kind of their attempt at a democratic Germany. This was a hard time. It was a hard time because politically there was a lot of infighting. There was even fear of civil war, especially in the years just immediately following World War I. Economically, it was hard. A lot of the basically a lot of the things that reparations for the war were quite, some would say, quite onerous, and so that had an effect on the economy that would later have even a larger effect as we would enter into the Great Depression at the end of the 1920s. So this was all kind of happening here. You had the rise of nationalists and right-wing groups. You had the rise of very left-wing and kind of communist groups, and they were clashing with each other. 1923 was also the year when Adolf Hitler had the beer hall pushed in Munich, who ended up in prison. He wrote Mein Kampf. So this is kind of all an interesting time period. And Miller is saying this is the time that the church needed to speak up. Because by the time you got to 1933, at this point, the Nazi Party was a leading force, especially in the Reichstag, the parliament. That was too late. But 1923, there was still time for the church to say something, to do something. And he's thinking that that's where we are at right now, is that this is the time when the church needs to say something, needs to basically, stand apart from the extremes, both the left and the right. And that's what I'm hoping I can do here in this podcast. As I said, there are a lot of questions with the Trump administration. How do we as Christians act? What do we do? How do we do it? And as a pastor, that's something that I'm struggling with. I don't want to make every sermon a political sermon that is talking about the Trump administration. But I do want to talk about, what does it mean to be a Christian at this time, and how do we live? And maybe I talk about what's going on indirectly, but to try to help my parishioners. And I say this as someone who is just a parish pastor. I'm not a professor. I'm not someone that is deeply schooled in a lot of of things, but I'm trying to kind of figure out what we should do. And so that's what I'm also hoping to bring, people who may have answers to those questions. But I'm also hoping to bring people who have questions. As I said earlier, we are at an inflection point in our nation's history. It's really a dangerous time. We've all heard the news of immigrants, people who have here on student visas, who are being picked up and possibly deported, basically not for any crime. They're not charged with any crime, but because of their beliefs, of what they have said. Now, some of the people, especially in the news, that have been picked up, their beliefs I don't agree with. But that's not the point. The point is that we believe in free speech, and we believe in certain values, and that I worry about how those values are being abused. And there is that question again of, how does the church respond? And that's, for me, as a Christian, especially as a mainline Christian, but I'm also interested in wanting to know, because I came from a evangelical background, how do evangelicals respond? Because I don't think every evangelical, as contrary to how we like to think, is in the tank for Trump. And how do we all deal with this? And maybe for me, these questions are way on me, because of course I also grew up in the Black church, and you really can't not talk about what's going on in the world. So I want just to let people know that we will still talk about the local church. That's important to me, very important as a local pastor. But I also want to talk about these things, and I hope that you will want to join in this talk about, what does this all mean, and where are we headed, and to how do we discern the times. So thank you for letting me kind of talk about all of this. But I do want to say that if you want to learn more about the podcast, if you want to listen to past episodes or donate, please go to churchandmain.org. You can also visit churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles that I've written. Please consider subscribing to the podcast. You can do that on your favorite podcast app, and you can leave a review. That helps others to find this podcast. Well, that is it for this episode of Church in Maine. I hope that you will consider passing this episode along to families and friends. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.